Elizabeth Cady Stanton was born on November 12, 1815, in Johnston, New York. She was one of the 11 children born to Daniel Cady and Margaret Cady. 6 of her siblings had passed away. Stanton was formally educated, which was a rare occurrence during that time period. She attended Johnston Academy and Emma Willard's Troy Female Seminary and received her formal education there. She studied a variety of languages including French, Greek, and Latin. She also studied maths, sciences, writing, and religion. Elizabeth Cady Stanton grew up with a void of paternal and maternal involvement due to the devastation of the deaths of her 6 siblings. Her mother became depressed, and with the death of her oldest brother, Eleazar, her father drowned himself in his work. She particularly remembered her father saying, "Oh, my daughter, I wish you were a boy." This gave her an understanding of her father's belief that boys were better than girls. This devastated Stanton. Stanton met her husband, Henry Brewster Stanton, during her involvement in the abolition movement. He was a journalist, an anti-slavery orator, and an abolitionist. When they got married, she asked the minister to remove the phrase, "promise to obey," from the wedding vows. She believed that when married, the two are equal individuals. The couple had 7 children together, and it is also noted that Cady Stanton grew to despise her domestic commitments. Their marriage lasted for 47 years, ending with her husband's death. During their marriage, there was a significant disagreement that made the two differ. Henry Stanton did not match Elizabeth Cady Stanton's level of support for women's suffrage, which was the main purpose of her advocacy. Although they both had different views in this particular area, the two believed that their marriage was still successful. Stanton and Susan B. Anthony met in 1851, which led to the formation of their long-lasting friendship. They both dedicated their lives to advocating for women's rights, such as through their collaboration in the formation of the National Women's League. These two women together influenced the women's rights movement during that time period and for many decades later. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one of the chief leaders of the women's rights movement. In 1848, after Stanton traveled with her husband to a World's Anti-Slavery Convention, herself and Lucretia Mott, a fellow women's rights activist and female abolitionist, were maddened by the exclusion of women's involvement. Soon after, Stanton and Mott announced the first women's rights convention ever in the world, also known as the Seneca Falls Convention. It was held in Seneca Falls, New York. At the convention, Stanton wrote the Declaration of Sentiments, which demanded social, educational, economic, and legal improvements for women. It especially demanded for the right to vote, and over 300 of the women and men that attended the convention signed the declaration. Specifically, the Declaration of Sentiments proclaimed that such laws which prohibit the equal rights of women in society contradict the laws of God. If a law classifies women as inferior to men, it is contradictory of the laws of God because God intended for all to be equal. Stanton expresses that the women should not be satisfied with their limited positions and encourages women to speak out and insists that they should have the same rights as men. The document strongly declares that if a government denies a person of their inalienable rights by God of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the person should thereby deny their allegiance to that institution and insist otherwise. Stanton and the members of the convention believe that it is their natural duty to insist upon the security of their rights and seek change in any institution that attempts to suppress them. Women had too long been denied their rights in marriage, in property, positions of high power, even participation in church affairs. Stanton emphasizes that each and all of these unfair deprivations degrades women and destroys their confidence, self-respect, and commonly results in their settling for a life that is dependent upon men. This convention set the foundation for the discussion and awareness for the women's rights movement. After the first women's rights convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York, the women's suffrage movement was in action. Under the leadership of women's rights reformers and suffragists such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, petitions and protests that fought for equal rights for women began circulating around Congress. Women's rights activists wanted to pass new reform laws, however, Congress was resistant to listening to what they considered to be an impotent group. Women began to realize that in order to become successful in attaining actual reform, they must first get the right to vote, thus leading the women's rights movement into a larger and more recognized one. After the Civil War ended, the 15th Amendment was passed, which stated that all American citizens were ensured voting rights regardless of their race or color. However, this was without mention of gender. Then in 1872, another women's rights activist and friend of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, tested this law when she voted for Ulysses S. Grant. A few weeks later, she was convicted of illegal voting and was arrested. This event inspired Anthony to offer her draft of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, also known as the 19th Amendment, to Congress in 1875, which would state that no citizen of the United States should be denied the right to vote, regardless of their sex. However, the road to women's suffrage was long and trying, because the first state to allow women to vote was Wyoming in 1890, which was more than a decade later. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony first met in 1851 at an anti-slavery meeting in Seneca Falls, New York. Their involvement in the abolitionist movement led to discussions about equality issues, which sparked their opinions about women's rights, which eventually influenced them to form the National Women's Loyal League in 1863. Together they were able to achieve many accomplishments related to women's equality. Remembering their old memories, Stanton recalls her first impression of Anthony and said, "There she stood, with her good, earnest-faced and genial smile, dressed in gray delaine, hat and all the same color, relieved with pale blue ribbons, the perfection of neatness and sobriety. I liked her thoroughly, and why I did not at once invite her home with me to dinner, I do not know." In November of 1895, Elizabeth Cady Stanton gave a speech to the reunion of the pioneers and friends of women's progress. She expressed that instead of by gender, the capabilities of people are measured by the individual. Also, since the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, women had received full suffrage in Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah. Stanton declared that in their next steps in the battle for full equality was to demand an equal place in the church by being able to hold positions like pastors and deacons, and to be able to have a voice in related matters. Many women participated actively in churches with their attendance and financial support. Therefore, they deserved just as much as men to be involved. She believed that it was also important that religious literature should not include negative assumptions about women being subordinate to men, for even the Fifth Commandment states, "Honor thy mother." On the subject of religion, Elizabeth Cady Stanton published The Woman's Bible, where she encouraged women to look around and recognize the full extent that religious organizations and general masculine influence had on their own liberties. In the Petition for Universal Suffrage of 1886, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, and other suffrage activists wrote to Congress to give the right to vote to both women and black people at the same time. After the 15th Amendment was ratified, that prohibited the denial of voting rights based off of race or color of skin, women's rights activists were even more determined to gain suffrage. However, the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote was not ratified until 1920. Elizabeth Cady Stanton died in October of 1902 in New York City. She is one of the first individuals in America to take a stand against the oppressive social norms of the 19th century and speak out for women, sparking the women's rights movement. Her legacy lives on through her groundbreaking efforts to bring social justice for women into a brighter light. From initiating conventions that brought attention to the important issue of gaining true equality for women to working with fellow activists in order to achieve their goals, Stanton helped create the foundation that continues to be built upon even to this day. Without the contributions that Stanton made, women today may not have been granted the laws that allowed women to begin to speak and act for themselves. Although over 100 years later, we still need to protest for equality-related causes, women have progressed greatly in society and will continue to grow towards improvement, having Stanton as an inspiring precedent.